Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is our Friday weekend edition, and Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us today. And, of course, we have a lot to cover, and we have posted a number of articles, everything from Michael Flynn to a very good piece by Dr. Merrill Matthews on predictive models. Of course, Penna Dexter's commentary today on capitalism and the coronavirus. Maybe even get into plastic bag bans and some of those things. But I thought, since it is Dallas, and we're not far from where the Dallas salon owner Shelly Luther was removed from the jail because of an action by the Texas Supreme Court. Maybe we'd start with that. But this has been in the news, Penna, for a couple of days, and it finally took an action by the Texas Supreme Court to release her from the jail.
And it was, this was a matter where the governor of Texas and the lieutenant governor of Texas, and also, of course, Ken Paxton, Attorney General, got involved in it. And I thought the most interesting one of those three was Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor, who offered, first of all, he says he's going to pay her fine, and he offered to do her jail time for her, but she's out.
Yep, and $7,000, and 7 days. She was there, 2 days, I guess?
2 days. My wife mentioned when we saw this, she said somebody's going to step up and pay her fine. Apparently, she has, if I understood the news last night, she's received $400,000 in her GoFundMe or
campaign.
Kickstarter.
Yeah.
$400,000, and it's amazing. She came out emotional from this, but she's become something of an icon. It wouldn't surprise me if we didn't see her running for office sometime in the future.
If people weren't listening, I guess we could explain it a little bit.
Why don't you do that?
They probably were when you've spoken about it or have been listening to the news. But this lady's name is Shelly Luther, and she's got a hair salon, a beauty salon. And I think it was 2 weeks ago she opened it up, even before they said that was okay. Because she said it was because she was going to go broke, or she wouldn't be able to feed her kids or pay her bills. And so she was then basically warned, and that didn't matter. And they put her in jail for doing it, and also fined her $7,000. And that just seemed to just about everyone to be a draconian punishment, not to mention she couldn't take care of her kids while she was in jail. And so it got a lot of attention. Not only in Texas, I saw it in the Wall Street Journal and all over the country, really, people were looking at this. I think she turned out to be sort of an example of the need for us to stand up for our freedom in this. The Americans have been pretty patient here on something that we're not so sure was necessary, and yet people have played along and done it, and it's time to get back to work.
Yeah.
And so it was good.
In fairness to the judge, who I think went too far, but she wasn't just being a shy person who was running around saying, I hope they don't catch me on this. She stood before a crowd and ripped up the citation.
And that was not good image, yes.
That sort of puts down a challenge to the Dallas County officials who feel like they've got to step in and do something. I think they went too far, but they did press the issue. And, this is just a normal person, but she's become something of a folk hero, especially among people who felt like we've actually shut this down too much.
The salon's called a la mode, so we're seeing signs saying, remember a la mode? And she will be speaking tomorrow at 11:30 with a number of people that have been on this program, like Stephen Broden and Colonel Alan West and David Barton and all sorts of people. So this isn't the end of it, but let's kind of get into the details for just a minute, because first of all, on the one side, the people that thought this was too strong you have a situation in which I thought, yes, she's probably going to get a $500 a day fine, or they're going to padlock the door. I didn't expect a $7,000 fine and 14 days, actually served concurrently, so it would be 7 days in jail. So that's on the one side, and then to actually enact that during Mother's Day weekend when she's a single mother was pretty strong. But on the other hand, let's go to our good friend Dale Hansen, who said, this is a good example that if you're a white person, the rule of law does not apply to you. And when they asked the people on Channel 8 News before Dale Hansen gave his commentary last night, do you think this punishment fit the crime? 3/4 of the people that got on their phones said that it did. So if nothing else, it illustrates, again, the incredible polarization, even in the Dallas area.
Oh, absolutely. It's become extremely polarized, as you've got, I think the polls I've seen, something like 30%, 35% feel like we've gone too far in the lockdown. But a large percentage think this is roughly either we haven't locked down enough or is generally justifiable. And what's coming out now, though, of course, is the people this is hurting most are going to be the lockdown, or lower income people who tend to be in service sector jobs and things of that nature who can't work from home. And so they're being hurt financially. And I have to say, if you're a politician who's still being paid while this is going on, you may not have the sympathy that some of the people who have, and she's, of course, an employer. It's not just her, it's employees that you feel so badly for.
Look at some of the people in the Dallas councils and the Dallas County commissioners, some of whom have been against this, and a lot of them tend to be African-American because they're simply saying,
absolutely,
you know, if you are affluent in North Dallas, you could probably weather the storm. There are people in hair salons in Oak Cliff that are saying, I have no food in the refrigerator. I have no money. I can't do anything else. And frankly, I've oftentimes thought that if Shelly Luther were to say, before she does this, let me see if I can find a few other hair salons that would do it as well. Kind of gets back to my argument on civil disobedience. Civil disobedience becomes kind of a natural movement because you can put her in jail. You can't put 100 hair salons in jail. If she had been able to get some individuals that were maybe represented by John Wiley Price, you know, John, you remember John Wiley Price right
yes,
now?
Indeed.
He's the one that's very much.
We typically don't agree with, but in this case, he was all for it.
Yes.
He's an African American, been on the city Dallas county commissioner county court for 30 years or so, but he was for getting his people back to work.
You know, I have read that different salon owners across the country haven't done exactly what she did. They've stayed a little more under the radar, and many have done it in their homes or gone to people's homes. You know, there are just people across the nation that are desperate to get their hair done by now, and so this has been it's been bubbling up, the salon thing, and you know, people's nails and hair. I mean, that's an important priority, but you know, it wasn't part of the exceptions to the lockdown. It wasn't a part of the essential businesses. And I'll add that the Wall Street Journal had an editorial just a few days ago about all the politicians who are imposing shutdowns, who are exempting themselves in various cases. And, of course, that's Mayor de Blasio of New York. But it also included Niall Ferguson, the epidemiologist in Britain, whose model said you're going to have 2.2 million deaths in the U.S., and that freaked out our politicians. He ends up having his girlfriend, who's married, coming to his place when they're supposed to be locked down.
Yeah, and Chris Cuomo caught and all sorts of others. I've said before, and since we're going to a break, I'll just make it quick and we'll come back and talk about some of that hypocrisy. One of the campaign issues, if you're running for office, to say, you know, when I get into office, I'm going to require that I and all the people in our legislature or Congress live under the same laws that you do, because a lot of people are perceiving that it's actually for you, okay, but for me, I have an exemption. And so we'll come back and talk about that and get into a couple of other really important issues. Shelly Luther is out, and we'll be speaking tomorrow along with a lot of people down there at Dealey Plaza. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we go forward on removing restrictions from the lockdown, how should we make rational and intelligent decisions? Andrew McCarthy brings us back to our legal system that places the burden of proof on the government. He recognizes that trying to make reasonable decisions about the pandemic during an election year is difficult. Everything, including science, has been politicized. Of course, it was politicized even before the election season arrived, but now it is worse. That is why he says government should bear the burden of proof. He says day after day, the system pits the government's compelling interest in public safety against our most fundamental freedoms, liberty, property, and in capital cases, life itself. By contrast, the argument from authority has no place in our justice system. We don't deprive people of their fundamental freedoms merely because an expert or a professional says that it should be limited. Our judicial system requires that the government bear the burden of proof. Accused Americans are presumed innocent. They are entitled to their fundamental liberties and do not have to prove their entitlement. In the current case, the public safety side and the liberty side need to examine scientists and even summon their own scientific witnesses, and their assessment can be subjected to cross-examination. Consider another issue, whether a business is essential or non-essential. It is not an American's burden to prove that his or her job is essential rather than non-essential, as some government official subjectively defines those terms. It is the government's burden to prove that the job in question cannot be performed safely under any conditions. These are the rules we use in court. No one wants to see infectious disease spread. No one wants to see the economy destroyed. Let's apply these century-old principles as we move forward to try to return the country to normalcy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we have in studio with us today Penna Dexter, Dr. Merrill Matthews. We have articles by both of them, which we will get to a little bit later. But Dr. Merrill Matthews, you brought up a good point. Tucker Carlson had this long list and very interesting clips from all the individuals that he could identify. Some of those ended up in that Wall Street Journal editorial as well. You mentioned Niall Ferguson. Here is a man that really scared everybody with this Imperial College idea that maybe 2.2 million Americans would die. And then they said, well, yeah, but that was just if there was no mitigation. But still, it scared everybody. And then, of course, you have Andrew Cuomo, but his brother, Chris Cuomo, was supposed to have been in the basement, but then got caught outside there. Let's pick one that isn't in that article, and that is the mayor of Chicago, who's an interesting individual, to put it mildly, who said, look, you know, I'm in the public eye, so I needed to get a haircut and everything. Well, all of us are on Zoom calls right now, so there is this idea that the laws apply to thee, but not to me.
And this is, I think, one of the reasons people elected Donald Trump, because they felt like the elitists out there are willing to impose all kinds of laws on us and not live under themselves. And one of the things, if you'll remember, in 1994, when Republicans took over the House, they said we're going to put in there a provision where laws that we pass in Congress have to apply to members of Congress. That has not stayed true because Obamacare.
They're a good example.
I think it was Senator Grassley from Iowa said we're going to have to we're put in an amendment saying we members of Congress have to live by Obamacare. We're and our staffs, and they immediately said, "Oh my gosh, that means we've got to pay for all these extra. We're higher income, so we've got to pay these outrageously high premiums." And so they found an exception for them. People feel like members of Congress, politicians, and other elitist people tend to do things that force us to do and they give themselves a pass on it.
Yes. Well, and one of the other questions that a lot of people have is that this uniform application makes no sense. I mentioned yesterday, and many of you probably saw in the Daily Signal, that if you look at the number of counties in the country, you have 1,630 counties which have zero COVID-19 deaths. I was just talking to the mayor of somebody that lives in Parker County. They have no deaths in Parker County, which is just one county over from Tarrant County, for example, for those of you. If you then add in those that have had one death, that's another 447. So that's 52% plus 14%, or if my math's right, and I went to a government school, so it may be off. But anyway, 66%. 2/3 of the counties in the country have never had more than one death, most of them zero deaths. And then it gets back to the piece I posted the other day, which we talked about through Brett Stevens, who we've had on the program in the past, lives in New York City, writes for the New York Times, supposed to be the conservative columnist. Okay, we can question that a little bit, but okay. But nevertheless said, look, the rest of the country should not live under New York rules because we are the hot spot. And I've rattled off some of the numbers. And if you just take even the top 5 states, you end up with most of the deaths in the country. And if you take just New York and New Jersey, you have a very high percentage. So, Penna, in some respects, I can understand why some people say, look, we're not in a hot spot, so after all, we maybe shouldn't have to live under those rules. But the reality is almost all the examples we've used have been from an individual in New York City, Chris Cuomo, a mayor in Chicago, or someone else that is in a hot spot that still says the rules doesn't apply to them anyway.
I don't know if you quoted this one, but I thought it was interesting to say that just 5 states account for 54% of all confirmed cases in the country. That's a huge statistic, too, to think about the cases, because a lot of people are saying, well, you know, I'm young, I'm not probably going to die of this, but I really don't want to get it. And the chances are you won't, and especially if you don't live in one of those.
or a nursing home. You know, the other day we did this whole thing on Sweden, for example. Half the deaths in Sweden were in nursing homes. And if you take that out as an unfortunate set of circumstances, then Sweden, which never locked down, looks a whole lot better than a lot of places and still looks better in the United States and most of the European Union countries. Looks a little worse than some of the nearby countries of the Nordic countries. But again, they think they've already gone through this, so there won't be additional deaths later on. So, again, when you start looking at not only is it, let's use the example that you just used a minute, the 5 states, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Illinois, and California, 54% of the cases, 61% of the deaths. And if you then locate where those took place in some of those nursing homes and add in the state of Washington where you had the nursing homes as well, you recognize that it really is in very strategic and very small localities, right?
You know, the question I just keep mulling over is, you know, these models that predicted this huge number of overwhelming patients in hospitals. If that part of it, that piece, had not been so widely publicized, would politicians across the nation, conservative people in various governments, and would the American people have been so willing to accept this? Given the, you know, we could predict there would be huge economic consequences, 14% unemployment, there are, that, you know, would there be more of a fight in Congress or some way to stop this if we had just questioned the models more? And I know that that's going to be a part of our discussion today. Dr. Matthews has written a great piece on it. But I just keep wondering that, you know, going back and thinking that was the justification, was to not get the healthcare system overwhelmed. We would have had to put up with deaths and sickness, which we've done in other pandemics. And we still may have to for the next couple of years that this thing is still around unless we get a vaccine. So, you know, would that all have been imposed on the country? Could we have avoided this massive economic sort of dislocation that's happening?
One of the things we're finding is that the vast majority, the large number of these are in nursing homes. So I was just looking, I couldn't find it, but I've seen a map of the United States which has the percentage of nursing home deaths in each state as a part of the COVID-19.
Right.
Texas, about 43% of the deaths, people in nursing home. When you get into Washington, Oregon, it's like 60%.
Yes, it is.
It's huge numbers.
Washington,
Now,
it's off
some
the
states,
charts.
I think Florida's smaller. It's more like 20, 25% or something like that. So you know who the at-risk populations are. And so to Penna's point, if you were just to say, we know that seniors, people with comorbidities like diabetes, high blood pressure, and so forth, respiratory diseases, these tend to be adversely affected. So we're going to try to mitigate it through them, but the rest of the country, you can get to go on. And that's not what they did. And I think we're going to look back on this and say we jumped into this with trying, I would say for many people with good intentions.
Yes.
But now the facts are coming in, the data are coming in. We didn't have it there early on, but now we're having the data, and it's just not. It just doesn't justify the steps that they took.
You know, it's a sense of letting the young people be productive out there, keeping a healthy economy would have benefited. You know, I don't want to make a clear conclusion on it right now in the middle of it, but could have been more beneficial to human life than what we are doing. It's very much looking more and more to me like that's the case.
Yes. Well, and again, we've given you some statistics, and one of my commentaries talks about for each 1% of increase in unemployment, there is a increase of usually about 1% for suicides, about 3.3 to 3.6%, depending on which study you look at, for drug overdoses. And those are just the easy ones. Some of the others are even harder to mention. As I mentioned yesterday, there's 16% of the people in one of these surveys that say, we're not sure we're ever going to come out again. And everybody goes, no, that's not right. And I said, no, you got to understand. Some of these people are in nursing homes. I say, no, I'm never leaving again. You have some people that have agoraphobia that actually never like to be out anyway. Has this lockdown made agoraphobia less likely or more likely? I think we all know the answer to that one. So you have 16% of the people that were surveyed in this one survey that are saying, I'm not sure we'll ever leave our homes again. And that is a very different world that we've ever been in before.
Created a real fear out there among people who normally are not fearful, but they are. And so things like not shaking hands, not hugging, and so forth, I suspect even after we get past this, that will sort of linger for a while for a number of people.
Yes. Well, I've had a number of people, no more hugs. Oh, no, can't do that.
I'm okay with it.
Yeah. Let's take a break, though. By the way, we are going to get to this. I just didn't want to have Dr. Merle Matthews
Remind
have to
me
say
not
it
to
twice.
hug you in a year.
Yeah, but this one on models. But I thought we'd come back for just a minute and talk about what churches can do, because you and, of course, our engineer, Andrew, attend a church which is pretty soon going to open up. And it would qualify, I think, in most people's minds as a mega church. So let's talk about what you're going to be doing there, and then we'll get into one of the other articles we've posted here, and that is about Michael Flynn. I thought that'd be another issue, because not only did we have somebody get out of jail, Michael Flynn actually had a reversal in his case. We'll talk about that. All that happened yesterday during the National Day of Prayer. Some people think there's a correlation, so I'll let you figure that out. But let's take a break, and Penna Dexter, Dr. Merle Matthews with us. We have a lot of articles that we've posted, and in the next couple hours, we're going to go through all of them if we can. We'll be right back.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Dr. Merrill Matthews. And for just a minute, I thought we'd talk about what churches are doing. So if you want to share what your church is doing, that will be the case. But Dr. Matthews, for just a minute, I'm going to put you on the spot because you go to Denton Bible. Andrew, our engineer, does as well. And of course, we've had Tommy Nelson in studio many times. You have, and I have as well. And it, I think, is setting a possible model for these mega churches. Last week, we did mention that there were a few kind of small churches where if you have kind of like a chapel and people are scattered out, you can do this easily. But what do you do when the church is, I'll consider a mega church, any church that has more than 1,000 members, and obviously Denton Bible does. So talk about what you're going to be doing.
Once Governor Abbott released that, the church sent out a note saying, we, as the elders have been talking about this, we don't think we're ready to go immediately on this, but we want to give 2 or 3 weeks to sort of figure out how we want to try to make this work. And so a week from Sunday, the 17th is the first day they're coming back. They have sent out rules. You have to let them know that you're coming. So you have to, in essence, RSVP. Every other row will be blocked off. Families must keep 3 seats in between families so that there's that social distancing. They want you wearing a mask. All their people will be wearing masks. Several of the ministries that are there will not be available at the time. And they're going to, Tommy said he's going to have to finish his messages earlier, which will be a challenge for him.
That's a challenge for most pastors.
Because they're going to come in and wipe down the whole sanctuary. Yeah. In fact, they'll have a time that starts, and you can't come in until that time. Then you're allowed to go in, but then you have to leave immediately so they can begin wiping it down. So they're going through all of these various processes, trying to sort of live as Christians under the law in a safe manner given the time. So they want to be examples for how to do this.
Yes. What about the kids?
Yes,
the little ones that are usually in the nursery?
Kids are going to be in the sanctuary with their parents. So the kids' ministries are not going to be occurring.
But again, you know, some of the larger ministries, you can think of Gateway or Stonebriar or Watermark or Prestonwood or First Baptist. They saying it's just too soon. But interestingly enough, you may be the first. Now this Sunday is Mother's Day. I don't know how many are meeting together for Mother's Day, but you're doing it the week after. Penna, your church is, I think, more typical where you're still doing Zoom calls, right?
Yes. My church, though, has done so much, but all distanced, because we have our Sunday service, which has been live streamed. And then we have a Zoom call, evening prayer every weeknight. So you can actually go to church every night. And we try to. It's about 30 to 40 minutes. And there's, it's more of a liturgical church. And so everybody can participate with that. And there's a small sermon. And it's just such a blessing to have it, like, especially certain nights when you're just tired of this.
Yes.
And so you could do that. A lot of classes and Bible studies still taking place.
And
then they're there on podcast for people. And I know of a lot of small groups that are meeting via Zoom.
Yeah, so again, for the larger churches, larger in the sense that they can actually do a video broadcast, then that is the possibility. But as we talked about a couple of weeks ago with Kelly Shackelford, some of those like small churches in Kentucky, either you meet together in the parking lot or you don't meet because they don't have that facility. So in some respects, the really small churches suffer. The kind of medium-sized churches are actually going to probably meet. But again, I think the first sort of large church is what you're doing there at Denton Bible. So it's kind of intriguing.
And, you know, Penna mentioned this going on every night at Denton Bible Church. Tom Nelson has been doing his quarantine Bible school. So he does a message at noon every day. And you and I talked about this a few weeks ago. My sense is that this is making the gospel available to a lot of people who had never heard it before. And I've not heard numbers on that. I've not heard people responses or so forth. But my guess is this has been very effective out there for people. I just haven't heard.
Yeah. Well, Greg Laurie reported on his church out in California that it was just amazing the number of listeners he had to the online services, and he feels that many, many, many hundreds of people have come to the Lord.
Yes. And it was interesting because we've kind of followed this because almost every week President Donald Trump says, I'm going to be watching, First Baptist or Harvest or Prestonwood. And then each one of those pastors has reported, like Greg Laurie, or certainly a variety of others that have reported. And again, as even the other day, we were talking with Jim Dennison. He said, I grew up in a non-Christian home in Houston. My father was very hostile to the idea of God and religion. But if even at that time I could have turned on a television set or gone to a computer and watched this, I might have heard the gospel much earlier. And you just think of all the individuals that, quite frankly, are never going to walk into church, of even a Gateway or a Prestonwood or something like that, who watch you online. Pretty amazing.
It's interesting because Jesus says the gospel is going to be preached to the uttermost parts of the world. And it's always been this sort of wonder, well, does that mean you're going to have to reach every area of the world? And with the technology today, there are certainly some poor countries that have trouble doing that, but with technology today, the gospel is reaching every part of the world.
I've been in I haven't traveled that much around the world, but I've done enough. I've been in some really poor parts of the world where they don't have indoor electricity, don't have indoor plumbing, but every one of those kids
everybody has a cell phone. Absolutely right.
And again, now because you've got not only Gene Getz, but now Tony Evans that have the QR codes in their Bible, that if they have access to a Bible or even have access to that, they can actually then study the Bible. They can see all those videos. And really, if you've got a cell phone and any kind of cell phone coverage, you have access to all the digitized information in the world. And you go to some pretty primitive places and you still see people with cell phones. Pretty amazing indeed. Just before we take a break, though, before we get into some other issues, I thought we might say, why is it we aren't seeing more establishments opening up, even some of the churches? And part of it, of course, is safety. But Penna, you and I've got in front of us here something that the Wall Street Journal is pointing out, that right now you've got trial lawyers that are filing suits against, for example, emergency supply manufacturers for false advertising. They're filing suits against colleges for refusing to refund student fees, filing lawsuits against cruise lines for emotional distress. Not if you died, but just even the stress of having been on that cruise. Filing lawsuits against retailers for wrongful death, against nursing homes for negligence, against governments for denial of hazard pay. And there is a push right now. As a matter of fact, Texas Senator John Cornyn and others are trying to have some kind of bill to protect some of the liabilities that are out there. You obviously, when somebody is negligent, should be able to sue them, but a frivolous or inappropriate lawsuit is just going to make it even, first of all, less likely that some of these businesses, maybe even some of these churches, will open up. And more importantly, even if they don't win the suit, because right now you have this very famous case that took place out of Chicago of this one individual that died who worked at Walmart. Well, how are you going to prove that he got the virus at Walmart and didn't get it somewhere else? So in some respects, I don't know how many of these suits will be winnable, but it's just the nuisance, just the incredible cost that causes a lot of people right now who are already concerned about safety, but they're also concerned about tort liability. What about that?
And, it's sort of the right and the conservatives that would like to see some sort of liability protection provided. It's the left, because of so much campaign donations from trial lawyers to Democrats, that oppose the liability, for the most part. And so, I think, they've been talking about more legislation for coronavirus. That would be something that could be part of new legislation, would be liability protections. But as I said, it is, and just to help businesses to make these decisions to open up, for one thing. Some have stayed open, and they could still be sued. Some of these places, like, as you mentioned, Walmart. So I think, we have to think of all ways now to encourage the economy to come back.
I agree. And, of course, the Republican leadership in the House and Senate have said the next bill, if they do another bill, it's got to have liability in there. President Trump, I believe, has said the same thing. And as Penna sort of alluded, the Democrats are pushing back on that. But you're not going to get an economy to open up unless you get some type of liability protection out there for employers who are just, in many cases, just trying to do the best they can. But if you're wiping things down, you're doing various things, you're trying to do as well as you can. But if somebody ends up getting the disease, and maybe you can make the case it was from the employer, maybe someplace else, you just don't know. It's just a real threat, and that's going to have employers very, very concerned about opening back up.
Again, how would you know that you needed this many ventilators or that you needed this many PPEs and all that kind of stuff? I mean, this is unprecedented, right? So it doesn't seem fair that you could actually, after the fact, do kind of what we call Monday morning quarterbacking, right?
You didn't have enough of this or that. You didn't have enough. That's one of the things that could be sued for. My employer didn't have the right kind of masks for us.
Yeah.
But that's because they couldn't get them.
Yeah. Or that didn't see it coming. And for those that say, well, they should have seen that, I don't think Anthony Fauci, even in January, thought that this was going to look like this. So if he didn't know, why would anybody else be expected to know? I don't know that any of these lawsuits necessarily would be winnable.
But you have to fight it, and that costs money.
It's just the cost. It's just the nuisance of it, and that's a big issue as well. Let's take a break. We'll cut a lot more to cover right after this.
The left, predictably, exploits the coronavirus pandemic to bash capitalism. The Wall Street Journal's Kim Strassel counters, to the extent America is weathering this moment, it is in enormous part thanks to the strength, ingenuity, and flexibility of our thriving, competitive capitalist players. The U.S. response has not been without its problems, but capitalism is providing many more answers than a centralized economy ever could. Ms. Strassel points to a big mistake that surfaced early on. Government maintained control over early test development and blew it. The private sector came to the rescue. Many companies are now producing high-volume tests. Retailers like Walmart and CVS converted parking space to drive-through testing sites. Private labs are processing those tests. Scores of big pharma and small biotech firms are searching for treatments and vaccines. Last week, the Journal reported that a collection of America's top scientists, billionaires, and industry titans delivered unique and aggressive plans for dealing with the crisis to the White House. After the 2009 swine flu outbreak, the Obama administration failed to refill the national strategic stockpiles of personal protective equipment. Private industry geared up to meet the needs. Companies now making masks and gowns include the iconic Brooks Brothers and MyPillow, whose CEO Mike Lindell converted 75% of his production to masks. General Motors, Ford, and Tesla ramped up capabilities to make ventilators. Grocery stores are providing special hours for the elderly and vulnerable to shop. Some quickly ramped up online ordering, pickup, and delivery. Restaurants, to stay alive, are offering takeout, curbside pickup, and delivery. Comcast, Sprint, and Verizon are guaranteeing online service, so crucial right now, even for customers who can't pay. Amazon is allowing profits to decrease, even as deliveries have skyrocketed. Capitalism will allow some businesses to be decimated in this crisis, and it will allow others to rise and fuel a recovery. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Penna Dexter, Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio. And next hour, on our national hour, we're going to talk about Michael Flynn and what has happened there. The Justice Department has dropped the case against him, but we've learned a little bit more about the investigations. We have a very good piece by Dr. Merrill Matthews on these predictive models. Then Betsy McCoy, it's been a while since we've quoted from her, prolonging the shutdown defies science and the U.S. Constitution. We'll get into a variety of other topics. But we have been talking about China, and I thought if you go to ipi.org, one of the individuals, of course, you've worked with for years, Tom Giovannetti, has talked about this Beat China Act. We talked about Tom Cotton, Senator Tom Cotton in the Senate, but this one has to do with Representative Chip Roy. But both of these are an attempt to say, you know, it doesn't make sense to keep all sorts of pharmaceutical important products being produced, or at least some of the elements being produced in China. Let's bring them back here to the United States.
And what they're trying to do is provide an incentive for companies to bring their manufacturing back to the United States. So companies across the country are rethinking their supply chains.
Right.
We've been too dependent upon China. They're increasingly thinking, just because of, if China has changed over the last 10 years under President Xi Jinping. It was under Deng Xiaoping it was becoming much more open. Now it's becoming much more closed, and companies moved their supply chains there through the 90s and 2000s. And as I point out, when actually show a graph, when U.S. taxes started becoming much higher than other countries, that's when the offshoring began.
Right.
In really widespread. So they're trying to do something to lure companies back. President Trump has suggested maybe what we need to do is force them to come back. What the act that Chip Roy is doing is suggesting providing some tax incentives, immediate expensing for companies that move their factories back here as a way to try to lure them back with carrots rather than sticks.
Yes.
And so that's what they're trying to do.
And I like what Tom says, that in policy you can do it one of two ways. You can either by force people to do things, or you can offer incentives. And if you believe in liberty, force isn't really a good idea. It should be your last result and resort. And so in some respects, it seems to me that why can't we provide some incentives? Now, again, this president sometimes wants to, bring the hammer down, but I just think we make it more lucrative to produce these here. And Dr. Merrill Matthews, you also have corrected me, and I need to say this one more time, that we accidentally said that half of the medically important substances are produced in China. It turns out that's a very high percentage. It's not that bad, but it's still of concern when some of our supply chain is dependent on what's happening in China.
That's right. Yeah, the notion that had been running around was 80 or 90% of our pharmaceuticals were produced in China. Turns out that was just a couple of reporters who took some numbers and misconstrued them, let's just say. But the majority are made in either China or India.
Yes.
But
and some in Mexico.
Some in Mexico, but a lot of them are made here in the U.S.
Correct.
And it's primarily generics that are made in other countries. And part of that is to be able to keep the generic price really low. But companies are rethinking that, and we may see a number of them come out, or we may see them shift to Vietnam and India right now. Just this past week has said, Prime Minister Modi is saying we want you to know that we're open for business, and if you don't want to keep your manufacturing in China and you want to bring it to India, we're eager to have that business. And so that's the world's largest democracy, and it might be an option for some businesses.
Yeah.
So what about the ingredients for medicines? I mean, you said that's not the correct number, 80-90% of medically important supplies. But what about ingredients for generic drugs and antibiotics and things like that? Active
pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs. I think if I remember right, roughly 30% of those are made in China.
So that's a problem.
Yeah, it's
especially
a problem.
If they start to play hardball.
That's right. Yeah. I think that tends to be on things like antibiotics and so forth, amoxicillin, stuff that we tend to use fairly regularly. That can change fairly easily, and I think a lot of businesses or manufacturers are saying we want to do that because we want to have some diverse supply chains, because things can hit the U.S. as well. And so you want some diversity in your supply chain, just as you want diversity in investments and other things. You just want to you don't want to be too dependent on any one thing.
Right.
And so, but I would argue that the tax reform that they signed in 2017 is actually doing as much as anything to lure businesses back. And President Trump has highlighted that, not just in pharmaceuticals, but in a range of different areas.
So in a sense, it might be good just to start talking up those benefits that were already passed into law by the tax reform. That would be one perhaps piece of the incentive.
Companies are doing that. And then Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico used to be one of our major hubs for manufacturing pharmaceuticals. But then Puerto Rico said, well, let's start imposing some taxes on these pharmaceuticals, and the federal government did as well. And a number of those companies actually moved their supply chains off from Puerto Rico. Of course, Puerto Rico is a territory, but these are American citizens who are working there. Yeah. So they started moving some of that manufacturing out of Puerto Rico, and the notion has been raised, maybe we should look at changing the laws there so that they might go back.
Well, we're talking about China. We're also going to be talking about the Great Decoupling, and that is a piece that comes from Gordon Chang. Now, Gordon Chang's been in studio with us. Recently, we had him by phone, but you're going to have a conversation with Gordon Chang, and that takes place through IPI. It's Thursday, May 21st, and oftentimes when you do an event, people have to go to it, but right now, there's an opportunity for anybody in the country to actually watch this,
That's open to the public. People can go to IPI.org and see that, and they can register to be part of that Zoom conference. So Gordon Chang was a China critic before being a China critic was cool.
Yeah,
and he's gotten a lot of attention over the last few years because of President Trump came in as a China critic, and more people are beginning to say there are significant problems in China. As I would say that's actually been growing over the years. That 10, 15 years ago, it was a much more open and opening economy. It's not so much anymore.
I remember back in the 90s, China bashing was in. We were doing a lot of it. And they became then members of the World Trade Organization. We passed most favored nation trading status with China. There were a lot of our friends who would join us on Point of View who were very much against that. A lot of the reasoning had to do with human rights violations and the way they treated their people, the way they treated Christians and religious people. That was a lot of the critique. But then it seemed like for many years, the globalization, just the economies of it, the way it made economic sense, the way both countries benefited, was working. And then, there started to be some of the imbalances that President Trump talked about in his campaign, although many people did not really think those were a problem. Trump kept saying, U.S. is losing. We're the loser. They're winning. Whereas a lot of business people said, no, we're both winning. We're both benefiting. And I think that's, for the most part, true. But we have these national security issues now. It's really economic security and national security go hand in hand. We've got to start paying attention to our economic security because it's part of our national security. And it's just a country that cannot be trusted, that's an evil actor in some cases. We've got to at least sort of separate from them, social distance, economic distance from that country to make us safer.
And again, Gordon Chang calls it the Great Decoupling from China. I have a guest coming in on Monday to try to explain why, in light of all things that have happened with China, the human rights abuses and everything else, people are still Chinese defenders. And he's got a very good piece that came out recently that gets into, some actually are getting financial benefits from it. Some are still holding to this, I think, naive idea that if we bring them into the company of other nations, they'll be more like us. Frankly, I think we've become more like them. So anyway, we'll take a break, and when we come back, we have a lot to cover, especially starting off with a decision by the Justice Department to drop the case against Michael Flynn. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is our weekend edition, and Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us today. Yesterday was the National Day of Prayer, and some people have said maybe prayer works, and I'm not necessarily saying there's always a correlation, but yesterday, for many of you that have been following the story of Shelly Luther, who was in jail for actually opening up her salon, she was released due to an order that came from the Texas Supreme Court. As we're going to talk about in just a minute, the Justice Department yesterday decided to drop the case against Michael Flynn. And if you also want to look at justice in the state of Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot down by two individuals, they actually now have been charged with murder. So just a lot of things happening simultaneously. But let's get to this issue of Michael Flynn, because it not only has to do with an individual who was supposed to still be serving as the national security advisor to the president, but it gives us, as I think both of you are going to acknowledge, some insight into some of the investigations, some of the misdeeds of the FBI. And I've said before that the good news for Michael Flynn might not necessarily be good news, and actually could be bad news for, who knows, it could be for James Comey, it could be for some of the other people that have actually worked in the FBI and have given the FBI a bad name. So, Penna, what do we know about this decision by the Justice Department to drop the case against Michael Flynn?
Well, we know that last week some embarrassing documents, that is embarrassing for the FBI, were released, and they showed their bias. And this undermined the case of the prosecution against Michael Flynn. He had pled guilty for lying to investigators about his discussion with the Russian ambassador to the U.S., and this was right before he'd been appointed national security advisor. By the way, he's a decorated general, and so they were out to get him for various reasons, which we can talk about later. But he'd pled guilty for lying, and it was never clear that he really did lie to the FBI. But it came to light that they basically threatened to bring charges against his son for not registering as a foreign agent for work that he was doing in Turkey. And so I think Flynn sort of pled guilty. He did have the discussion with the Russian ambassador, and he pled guilty for lying about it to save his son.
Yeah. And
so, he was being prosecuted. He ended up, I think it was last year, going back and asking to sort of withdraw that guilty plea. And he had a new lawyer, Sidney Powell.
Yeah.
And so they've been working, and now this has come out. And one thing that happened was Bill Barr appointed a new guy, Jeffrey Jensen, a U.S. attorney, to start working on this case. And things started showing up. These documents came up. And so it's just, I think it's been something a lot of people have been praying for. Donald Trump has said that it was very unfair. And it was just part of the left's and the Democrats' way of trying to get at Trump. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But they were really trying, because Trump and Flynn were going to try to reform the intelligence agencies. And K.T. McFarland, who was supposed to be Flynn's deputy in the National Security Agency, has said this, that they were going to go back and reform national intelligence agencies and there was so many people threatened by
sure.
that
draining the swamp.
Yes, absolutely. It was part of draining the swamp. And so I just love seeing this for a lot of reasons.
Andrew McCarthy, we've also mentioned, suggested that maybe he wasn't the target, but he was the obstacle because they wanted to continue the investigation on Donald Trump. And because he was one of the few experienced people, he would have figured out somewhere along the way. But kudos to Sidney Powell. I know you know the lawyer, Sidney Powell. I'm not sure what the lawyers he had before were doing, but when she came in, my goodness, she was able to get these documents. And this does not look good to the FBI leadership, does it?
When she mentioned this, and I think it was about last August or so, I can't remember exactly when she came in, she told me, and I thought, well, good luck with that, because I think myself and Americans in general have sort of, the FBI is kind of above politics.
Yeah,
historically, we sort of thought this is a good organization. They wouldn't be doing something like that. And so if Michael Flynn, and because we don't know, I mean, we're not involved in that. If he had sort of pleaded guilty on that, maybe he did do something wrong. And now the information that's coming out is just this is a bad day for the FBI.
Yeah. You have the filing in front of you right here.
Yeah, I have the filing here. This is something you can get it online. This is what the Justice Department gave to the court. It's a long document. I think it's 108 pages or something like that. I just printed off a couple of them. But it starts out, the United States of America hereby moves to dismiss with prejudice the criminal information filed against Michael T. Flynn. Now, what with prejudice means is don't bring this back.
Yeah.
You've messed this thing up.
Yeah.
Do not try to bring this back because we are opposing it. Then it goes on to say, after a considered review of all the facts and circumstances of this case, including newly discovered and disclosed information appended to the defendant's supplemental pleadings, that's what Penna was referring to, the government has concluded that the interview of Mr. Flynn was untethered to and unjustified by the FBI's counterintelligence investigation into Mr. Flynn. These are amazing things it's talking about. This is Justice Department. FBI is part of the Justice Department. It's being extremely critical. And if our listeners are interested, the Wall Street Journal has a piece today on the editorial, The Vindication of Michael Flynn, where they go into more of this. Or if you go there online, they'll have a link to the Justice Department's document. So you come away with bad taste in your mouth of James Comey, even Robert Mueller and some of the others. I'm curious to hear if they will come out and make some kind of statement about this, some of the people, but this does not look good for these individuals.
And again, some people, Penna, might be thinking, well, I don't know General Flynn. Well, first of all, this is a man with 3 stars on his shoulder, okay, on both sides. So he's got 6 stars if you want to look at it that way. And if they can do this to the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, an individual that has served a number of presidents, including previously Barack Obama, if they can do that to him, they can do it to any American.
That's right. That's right. And the interesting part about this is this is it also looks bad for the Robert Mueller investigation.
Yes, it does.
And, I think the Mueller investigators had some of these documents. I don't know if they had all of them, but they knew that he was unfairly targeted. And, some people are saying that this is actually one of the elements that's going to cause the collapse of the Mueller investigation. And what happened is the Director of National Intelligence that we have now, Richard Grenell, he also let Adam Schiff, who's chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, know that he's got now ready for release 6,000 pages of documentation from that whole Russian collusion investigation. Yes. Great. Schiff doesn't want him released now.
I think they've actually released them this morning, though.
Did they release them? Okay, I missed that.
Drug them over there. And by the way, for those of you that are kind of interested in following that, if you go to our Thursday edition, which is yesterday, we actually posted a very good piece on Adam Schiff and the Facts by John Solomon. Here's what he said. Here's what the document said. Here's what he said. Here's what the document said. He was not very honest. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we go forward on removing restrictions from the lockdown, how should we make rational and intelligent decisions? Andrew McCarthy brings us back to our legal system that places the burden of proof on the government. He recognizes that trying to make reasonable decisions about the pandemic during an election year is difficult. Everything, including science, has been politicized. Of course, it was politicized even before the election season arrived, but now it is worse. That is why he says government should bear the burden of proof. He says day after day, the system pits the government's compelling interest in public safety against our most fundamental freedoms, liberty, property, and in capital cases, life itself. By contrast, the argument from authority has no place in our justice system. We don't deprive people of their fundamental freedoms merely because an expert or a professional says that it should be limited. Our judicial system requires that the government bear the burden of proof. Accused Americans are presumed innocent. They are entitled to their fundamental liberties and do not have to prove their entitlement. In the current case, the public safety side and the liberty side need to examine scientists and even summon their own scientific witnesses, and their assessment can be subjected to cross-examination. Consider another issue, whether a business is essential or non-essential. It is not an American's burden to prove that his or her job is essential rather than non-essential, as some government official subjectively defines those terms. It is the government's burden to prove that the job in question cannot be performed safely under any conditions. These are the rules we use in court. No one wants to see infectious disease spread. No one wants to see the economy destroyed. Let's apply these century-old principles as we move forward to try to return the country to normalcy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, as we are talking about in our weekend edition, Michael Flynn, and again, I'm using this as an example to say if they could do this to an individual that was the national security advisor to the President of the United States, an individual who has served with distinction all of his life, and force him to eventually admit to lying when he had a phone conversation, which is quite appropriate with the ambassador, Sergei Kislyak. And then it turns out, as we look at this piece on the vindication of Michael Flynn, it points out that James Comey actually told his deputies not to inform the White House General Counsel that they were going to meet with him. Talked about in a video that I've seen in which we just thought we could kind of get away with it, not to tell the White House about the conversation or that they even knew about the conversation with the ambassador, and let him talk long enough and find at least some place in the transcript where he talked with the Russian ambassador that he didn't talk about in there, and then say, well, that's lying. And then after all that point of time, in January, they actually acknowledged in some of the documents that he never actually lied to the FBI agents. He just simply forgot one part of the conversation that he didn't know they had a transcript for. And then you have the loyalists saying, oh, well, don't end this investigation, continue on. And at that point, then we go to Robert Mueller, who apparently should have known that all of this was a sham at the beginning, and all the horrible things that have been said about Michael Flynn, not to mention losing his house, his finances, and being threatened that his son would then be investigated.
And millions of dollars in legal fees.
All of those kinds of things. All over an act that nobody has ever been prosecuted for that was implemented in 1799, So these are some issues that should concern all of us, and it shows, again, can I use the word malfeasance on the part of some of the leadership of the FBI?
Yeah, the question I have now is, what about the media? How's this going to be treated in these immediate days ahead? I haven't, I've seen the stories in the papers, and I haven't really seen it on any TV networks yet. But how are they going to? I mean, really, this is a huge breakthrough in one sense. It's a huge vindication of not only Flynn but Trump, and just, I mean, here Trump gets attacked over the coronavirus, which actually he made some pretty good early decisions on. But at that time, he was being impeached. And, you could really tie everything together back to the beginning of his presidency and the things that he's had to fight off and face. And it's good to see the legal machinery, at least, and the leadership of the FBI now, or the Justice Department now, come in and actually bring justice to someone.
The Wall Street Journal suggests that the media will spin this as one more sign that the Justice Department is under the thumb of Trump, and that they're just essentially doing his bidding. Okay. And I was reading through Politico this morning, and that's exactly what they're doing. Yeah. This is one more sign that they would say of the pressure being put on the Justice Department to end these things that are likely to find all these problems with Trump. And that is just not the case. You go through this, and Bill Barr is, I think, a highly respected. He's been a great attorney general so far, but he's been impartial. And if you find these things, and they're going to have the documents to show this, the media, they are going to spin it as one more victory for Trump in his pressure campaign, but I think it's just the opposite.
Well, and again, let's just recognize that this is still ongoing. So you have the Attorney General, Bill Barr. Can I put another name on the page here? John Durham, right, who's doing all the investigation.
Really looking forward to that.
Yes, and in some respects, it might be better if it happened after November, because then people wouldn't be saying, well, this was just a campaign stunt. But at the same time, the wheels of justice, though they grind slowly, it might be time for some of that to drop, because what you have is, from the very beginning, an attempt to, first of all, investigate the Trump campaign for so-called Russian collusion based upon a document that was disinformation. That's a nice word for it. And then the attempt to continue this on now after Donald Trump is elected president, and to carry this out for all these years. And then when basically Robert Mueller comes up with nothing, then they switch from the Russian collusion to, of course, Ukraine, and then the impeachment. And this has dogged this president since his campaign and through all of the time that he served as president of the United States.
And the media occasionally talk about his temper. He gets angry and so forth. Well, that probably is true. Most of the presidents do at times. But with some justification on this. I mean, since we don't know, being out here, whether or not the truth of the allegations and so forth, as it's emerging, it's coming out that Donald Trump was right on almost all these things, at least generally speaking. But if you're innocent of this and you're continually being persecuted by your own FBI, you have a certain justification in being upset about it. And especially if I go and take a step, of course, he fired James Comey, but if I step into this, it gets painted as me being vindictive, when in fact it might be just me cleaning the house of people who shouldn't be there.
I've been amazed at how he can put one foot in front of the other and keep his head down and do a lot. I mean, he's done a lot as a president when you think about the campaign promises that have been kept and the things he's accomplished. And there's never been a day where he hasn't been under all of this attack.
Yes. Well, listen, also, yesterday I mentioned that we posted this piece by John Solomon, who's been investigating this for some time. And there have been a variety of others, but I'll give him the credit in justthenews.com. And because we have all these documents out, and more to come, by the way, so this will, by the way, if you print this out, it's going to take you about 10 to 15 pages. I don't remember even how long it takes. And here's the claim by Adam Schiff in his report. Here's the declassified facts. Here's the claim by Adam Schiff in his report. Here's the declassified facts. And on every single point, you can see that he was to be charitable, misrepresenting. I think the better word would be lying about a number of things, but because they were classified, nobody could challenge him on that. And again, this is the individual that was really leading most of the charge in the impeachment against the president of the United States.
And the statements he made were just the statements that he wanted to be true.
Yes.
For the most part.
And not only leading the charge, but also leading the effort to keep these things from getting out. Because, and that's been the question from the past few weeks is, why is he so adamant about not letting, when Grinnell said, I'm going to release these things if you don't, because the House had already voted unanimously previously to release it. And if Schiff doesn't do it, I'm going to go ahead and do it, the Director of National Security, which I guess sort of forced his hand. But the question always been, what does Schiff see in here that he doesn't want the rest of us to see?
Yes. Well, and when you look at the other documents on Michael Flynn, you just are surprised that sometimes people don't take piece of paper and tear them up. Nancy Pelosi's good at that, I've noticed, but you see some of these in their handwritten notes and their memos and their emails, which actually, if you had a mainstream press that had any curiosity about this at all, would be obviously considered to be the smoking gun or the silver bullet or whatever metaphor you want to use. And you would think some of that stuff would have been destroyed, and probably was. So if you have this much evidence of how individuals were trying to destroy the reputation of Michael Flynn and trying to bring down this president, how much more now that we're going to find because of some of these declassified documents.
And, of course, we had here just recently the Carter Page incident in which the FBI actually changed documents to so that it would not appear that Carter Page was actually working with the CIA so that they could get the FISA court to investigate. This is amazing stuff. And why people are not in jail on this yet, I don't know.
I don't know. And the sad reality is, as I've said before, and I could be wrong, I don't think that the ironed gates and jail bars are going to go clanking against any of these individuals. And yet, frankly, some of these individuals certainly do need to serve time. But I don't know that's going to happen. What do you think?
I agree. And maybe they're waiting for the Durham report to come out before they clamp down on this. But somebody needs to be paying a price for it.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get back to the coronavirus and the pandemic. And Dr. Merrill Matthews has written a very good piece, and I really do encourage you to take the time to print it out. This one, unlike the other one I mentioned, will only take you 3 pages to print out, but a very good piece by our Dr. Merrill Matthews on predictive models dominate our lives, not always for the better. Now, some of these economic models tend to be a little closer, and some of these actuarial tables tend to be a little more accurate. But when you start talking about these climate models or these models for the pandemic, I mean, these are not sometimes even in the right order of magnitude. So I'm going to let Dr. Matthews kind of explain that. Penna's, of course, read this too. We'll get into that. And by the way, I might mention Penna's commentary, which you'll be able to hear a little bit later, Capitalism versus the Coronavirus. So we'll get into some of those issues. Also, the piece by Betsy McCoy, Prolonging the Shutdown, Defies Science and the U.S. Constitution. So we've got lots to cover. And if you'd like to find some of these articles that we are referring to, they're on the website, pointofview.net. I guarantee if you post a few of these on your Facebook page or you have a Twitter feed, you'll get some response. And these are really well done. So we're going to talk about the predictive models with Dr. Merrill Matthews and Penna Dexter right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
You know, as we've talked about the virus pandemic, we recognize that a lot of the policies and a lot of the rhetoric and even debate has really come from these models. And so, Penna Dexter, if nothing else, I appreciate the fact that Dr. Merrill Matthews has written a piece here on predictive models dominate our lives, not always for the better.
Well, it's a very good piece, and it doesn't throw models out. They are necessary. They are helpful. but I think it gives us a realistic take on it.
And what we were trying to do, I've been thinking about doing this for some time, and the pandemic and the models that came up from there just sort of threw me over the edge. We had to do this because so much of what our listeners, of what affects their lives, are based upon these models. So virtually all major legislation, if it's going to have a tax or budget implication in Congress, has got to have the Congressional Budget Office do what we call a score, which estimates the cost or the impact on the budget and so forth. And if it's too high or too low, members of Congress vote for it or vote against it. The climate models that come out regularly, when you hear people coming on saying, we think it's going to be, the oceans are going to rise to X number of level and we're all going to be drowning, or we're all going to be sweating because it's going to be so hot in the next 20 years. Even the Green New Deal is all sort of predicated on this notion that models are out there are giving us accurate information. And now we have the pandemic come up, and the models are that sort of really threw our policymakers into this is the notion that we were going to have 2.2 million deaths in the U.S.
Do you think that the debacle that was these models for coronavirus are going to sway the environmentalists from their push to change everything in the economy to battle climate change?
I don't think it's going to sway them at all. I think they like these models coming out, and for the modelers, and I don't want to impart too bad motives on there, but the modelers know if they come out with a climate model that says, temperatures are going to continue going up a little bit every year. But we've been doing that since the end of the Ice Age, and sea levels may continue to rise a little bit, but we've been doing that since the end of the Ice Age as well. If they were to say that, they wouldn't get any attention. The only ones that get attention are when they say the models are showing us that we're going to have these huge amounts of water coming in. New York's going to be flooded, Miami's going to be gone, and we're all going to be having to compress because we can't go to the beach anymore because the water is going to be so high. That gets the media's attention because they like the worst case scenarios.
They do, but I wonder if now with coronavirus and what has happened to our country and the whole world and to all of our economies, if it's going to make their job harder in trying to convince us, even if they've got the media on their side, trying to convince lawmakers that, we need to do these things to all of our energy and all kinds of policy making.
I think one of the things that really frustrates the environmentalists and the media is the fact that they keep trying to convince us that this is happening. And so many Americans don't believe it. So when they do the poll of what do you think are the most important issues, environmental issues tend to be way down the list. They just are not the key thing that the media and the environmentalists want us to see. And one of the things that this is doing is I hope there will be some healthier skepticism. As you point out, models are used. Models are good for us. You want to have good, honest modelers trying to figure out what the impact of a law is going to be and on the environment, on our budgets, and so forth. But you take it with a grain of salt, and there are other models that oftentimes say something different.
Even Dr. Fauci said that the models are only as good as what's put in, the numbers that are put into it. And this is what I'm just going to read from your piece here, buddy. Both the U.S. and U.K. leaders were advocating measured response to the coronavirus pandemic until the UK's Imperial College London released its model's results, predicting 500,000 deaths in the UK and 2.2 million deaths in the US. This freaked out health officials in both countries, you say, and then they began promoting stricter guidelines, shutting down economies and pushing shelter-in-place orders. And then, we can say, okay, well, that mitigated some of the bad effects, which it did, I'm sure. But, that's a lot. That's a big discrepancy.
And within something like 2 weeks after Niall Ferguson came out with that prediction, he came back and said, well, we're changing the British estimated deaths from 510,000 Brits dying to maybe nearly 20,000.
Which is more than an order of magnitude change.
That's a really big change. And so it was amazing that he made that. And he said, we didn't change the model. We just changed some of the assumptions, and they're based upon the social distancing and so forth. Maybe so. but most of the models were predicting really high numbers. I think even in the U.S., a couple of the models were predicting 200 to 300,000 deaths early on, and now they scaled those back they were back in the 60 or 70. President Trump said, well, we may actually get 100,000 deaths, but many times they're talking about into August or towards the end of the year, so it's a longer span there. But it's a terrible case, but not as bad as some of the models had initially predicted. And for those of our listeners who had to sit home for 2 months, a lot of that is based upon a predictive model.
Yes. Some people say, well, why do I care about models? Well, it just affected your life. But let's take
and your income.
Yeah, and your income, and maybe your business or your inability to make an income. But the one on the horizon that you talk about as well are these climate models. And you point out that nearly all the climate models that actually have been cited don't take into account what has been a hiatus in terms of warming for 14 years. The model said it's going to go up like this, and it didn't.
Right.
And so as a result, we're talking about everything from the policies that were trying to be implemented under the Obama administration, the attempt to try to pass a Green New Deal. But more than that, even the kinds of comments being made by major businesses and all the rest, all are based upon a model. And I've heard you say on other radio shows, and so why don't you say it on this one too, that lots of times people will say, well, trust the science. But they aren't talking about the science. They're talking about the models.
They're talking about the model, and that's just it. The reporters and others will say you've got to trust the science. We heard that on the pandemic models as well. You got to trust the science, but models are not science. You may have scientists working on them, but they are based upon the assumptions the scientists put in, which may or may not be accurate. And you're talking about the future. And even on something like that, sometimes you can predict on models within a few weeks, a few months, maybe a year or two. But on the climate change models, they're oftentimes talking 50 to 100 years out. And you just don't know what's going to happen between now and then. But the warming hiatus was about a 14-year period from about 1998 to 2012, 2014, somewhere in there, and the Earth's temperatures remained relatively flat. Because it did, almost all the models from the late 90s and early 2000s were wrong. They grossly overestimated the heating. And then they had to come back, and if they go to the piece that I have that I wrote on that on the Hill, I've got some of the links to the groups, the National Organization, the Atmospheric Association, some others trying to explain why there was a discrepancy, most of which come up to say, well, it really wasn't a discrepancy if you take these things. No, in fact, the temperatures were basically flat. I remember the New York Times even running a piece, this is probably 7, 8, 9 years ago, along the lines of, has global warming ended? What are we going to do now? It's not doing what we thought it was supposed to do.
Yeah. So again, one of the things I think is so helpful is just a reminder that these models actually dominate our lives. We've already talked about how our lives have been, in some respects, destroyed or devastated or at least drastically changed on the issue of the pandemic. The models that are being used to actually implement all sorts of environmental policies. And then you start out by reminding us that every piece of legislation, the Congressional Budget Office, which tends to be more wrong than right, is the gold standard, and that's how they evaluate pieces of legislation. So we should be pretty skeptical about all this, shouldn't we?
And that's why initially I thought about calling it the tyranny of the modelers. Yeah. But then I thought that's probably too strong, because there are good modelers out there who are doing a good job of trying to do the best they can to make some kind of predictions that are going to be faithful to what actually happens. And sometimes they get it right, but oftentimes that's why I quote the statistician Box, who says all models are wrong, but some are helpful.
So case in point, buddy, ACA, President Obama, because of models, was able to say, I did not sign a plan that adds one dime to our deficits,
That's exactly what he said.
Either now or in the future. And so, it depends, again, on what models you use.
They did 10 years of taxes and 6 years of benefits in order to make it balanced over but in the 11th year, it's going to start costing a lot more than you're taking in.
Again, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, Penna Dexter's commentary you can watch or listen to right now, because that always takes place at about this time. Capitalism versus the coronavirus. And a lot of people are criticizing capitalism. All this is due to capitalism. I don't think so. And you'll hear her commentary, and then we'll talk with her about it right after this.
The left, predictably, exploits the coronavirus pandemic to bash capitalism. The Wall Street Journal's Kim Strassel counters, to the extent America is weathering this moment, it is in enormous part thanks to the strength, ingenuity, and flexibility of our thriving, competitive capitalist players. The U.S. response has not been without its problems, but capitalism is providing many more answers than a centralized economy ever could. Ms. Strassel points to a big mistake that surfaced early on. Government maintained control over early test development and blew it. The private sector came to the rescue. Many companies are now producing high-volume tests. Retailers like Walmart and CVS converted parking space to drive-through testing sites. Private labs are processing those tests. Scores of big pharma and small biotech firms are searching for treatments and vaccines. Last week, the Journal reported that a collection of America's top scientists, billionaires, and industry titans delivered unique and aggressive plans for dealing with the crisis to the White House. After the 2009 swine flu outbreak, the Obama administration failed to refill the national strategic stockpiles of personal protective equipment. Private industry geared up to meet the needs. Companies now making masks and gowns include the iconic Brooks Brothers and MyPillow, whose CEO Mike Lindell converted 75% of his production to masks. General Motors, Ford, and Tesla ramped up capabilities to make ventilators. Grocery stores are providing special hours for the elderly and vulnerable to shop. Some quickly ramped up online ordering, pickup, and delivery. Restaurants, to stay alive, are offering takeout, curbside pickup, and delivery. Comcast, Sprint, and Verizon are guaranteeing online service, so crucial right now, even for customers who can't pay. Amazon is allowing profits to decrease, even as deliveries have skyrocketed. Capitalism will allow some businesses to be decimated in this crisis, and it will allow others to rise and fuel a recovery. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, and Kelly Shackelford, sorry, I'm so used to saying Kelly. Dr. Merrill Matthews, and Kelly will be with us next week, so I just got one head of myself on that. But Dr. Merrill Matthews, who we just had a chance to hear from, and again, this one on capitalism versus coronavirus. Penna, very good, because now you're starting to see everybody blaming big companies, capitalism, and everything for this virus and the pandemic. And I think you're just trying to bring a little bit of common sense in this conversation.
Well, remember early on, a couple of months ago, I guess, they were saying, a lot of folks were saying that because of China's system, they were able to lock down in Wuhan, and they were able to improve the situation. We could never do that in the U.S. because we're too free, and we have a capitalist economy. And then President Trump then began trotting out various companies with innovative ideas and plans to do things. And I'm looking and going, this is a president that respects capitalism. He respects the private sector. He comes out of it himself. And so he's going to bring that to bear. And he doesn't believe he's the smartest person in the world, but he knows that there are other leaders who are smart, and he can bring that together. And that's really, it's been a battle between the left and the right during this whole coronavirus. The left is exploiting it to bash capitalism, as Kerby said. And, Kim Strassel, Wall Street Journal, she sometimes sums things up well. And she says, to the extent America is weathering this moment, it is in enormous part thanks to the strength, ingenuity, and flexibility of our thriving, competitive capitalist players. Admittedly, there are problems, especially with testing at the beginning. But, that was a government problem because the CDC was just kind of, guarding its turf. And they wanted to do all the testing, and it just wasn't working out well. So companies began to ramp up their testing. We had private companies have now released tests. We're getting a lot more testing now. We're getting the results, the ability to provide the results, which was also a problem. So, the private sector. Then you heard retailers like Walmart, CVS, converting their parking lots, so their parking lots, giving them over to drive-through testing sites. And then, even Big Pharma, who's always bashed, and small biotech firms they're all over the place, all over the world, searching for treatments and also for vaccines. And Buddy will talk about one that has a lot of promise. And then there was this one piece, and you and I talked about this last week, Kerby. The Wall Street Journal reported on this. All these scientists, one billionaire or some billionaires and scientists and others who got together, and they started just having sort of cabals where they would try to brainstorm treatments and plans to help us get through this crisis. And they delivered a bunch of those very aggressive plans to the White House. So we'll probably be hearing more about that. And these were people out of the capitalists, that have succeeded in capitalism. And, one other failure of government that's really hurt us right now has been the fact that after the swine flu outbreak, the Obama administration used up a lot of the supplies, mask, gowns, and things, and they chose, it was probably a budgetary choice, not to replace those. So we ended up short when the coronavirus hit. And so a lot of companies have converted some of their production to go ahead and make some of these things. For example, Brooks Brothers making masks and gowns. My Pillow, Mike Lindell, who hasn't heard those commercials? He actually gave over 75% of his production capacity to making masks. So we've got the car companies making ventilators now. Yeah. Trump had to push that a little bit. And then, I've benefited from ordering online for groceries all during these shelter-in-place times. And the restaurants, in trouble, of course, but providing takeout or delivery. So, we have all of that. Now, in capitalism, you do have this sort of creative destruction that happens anyway, and that's going to happen. We've seen bankruptcies. We've seen Neiman Marcus. We've seen J. Crew filing for bankruptcy.
We've seen Jim.
Yeah. So a lot of bankruptcies that some companies may not make it through this. But the other part of that is that it will be the capitalist system that allows other companies to come in and to rebuild the economy. So capitalism is really, they don't save us. It's really the incentive, though, for Americans to do right things, risky things, to their own benefit, that allows our country to be an economic powerhouse. And yes, we are in a bad time right now, but I do believe over time, and if we allow our country to stay free, and the government doesn't think it has to come in and run everything, we'll come out of this and we'll be strong again because of the system.
And it kind of relates a little bit to that idea of Donald Trump with a public-private partnership. And because he's a businessman, he knows some of these companies and some of these CEOs. So pretty incredible. Penna mentioned just a minute ago, Dr. Merrill Matthews, one of these breakthroughs, remdesivir. And talk about that because it does look like that may be very effective. And that's been around for a while.
Remdesivir has been around since the 90s, I think. And it is an anti-inflammatory, I believe. And it's made by Gilead Sciences. They're the ones who created Sovaldi, which was our first cure for hepatitis C. It cures like 95% of the people who take it. But they've had this around for a while. They started using it, and it is in a phase 3 trial right now, but it's also being used for humanitarian purposes because the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, has approved the use of this on a sort of expedited manner. And I'm seeing stories of people who are saying, we got this. It's shortened our stay. We saw changes immediately. Saw one of the local news last night here in the Dallas area where within 24 hours, a person who was on a respirator and really declining quickly started having an immediate turnaround. 3 or 4 days later, that person was able to leave and is doing fine now. So this is, the testing is fine. I think the testing is great. You ought to have testing. But I've always thought what you need is a treatment, even if it's not a cure. If you're able to have a treatment that reduces the symptoms and allows your immune system to come in and kick in and overcome this, like Tamiflu, which isn't a cure for the flu, but it does help you. Especially if you get it earlier, and that's what they're saying with remdesivir. That is our solution that we need to be able to get the economy going and to get people moving again, because if they know they have a solution here, they have a treatment they can go to, then I think people are less worried.
Yeah, again, not a cure, but a treatment, and a treatment that can reduce the issues of inflammatory issues, because lots of times it's your immune system overreacting anyway.
Right.
That's a good way to address that. And there's just a lot of successes that we are finding because we have creative individuals, not only in the capitalist system, but in the medical field that are just trying things out, Penna, and learning from those
the point that Buddy just made, I know we're just about on the break, but if you're reticent to come back out because you don't want to get it or you don't want to pass it along to somebody, and you know that you have something that can help you get through it. I mean, a lot of people, we just keep hearing so many things about how bad it can be for some people. Then it's like with the flu. We're not as scared of these other flus that are out there because we know that if we get it, it's going to be awful, but we're going to have some help, some medicines that will help us to weather it. And, we'll eventually get through it. And I think if people start to feel that, because there's a couple of treatments that are going to help out there, that will help the economy and just activity to begin moving and churning again in the country.
Very good. Let's take a break. When we come back in the next hour, we'll talk a little bit about, Betsy McCoy has talked about prolonging the shutdown defies science and the U.S. Constitution. So we'll look at it first from the scientific point of view, and that kind of gets us into herd immunity. I always hate that term, but nevertheless, because I don't feel like we're herd. But anyway, herd immunity and immunity generally, and the testing, and then also, of course, the constitutional issues. And then another piece that actually is a Michael Moore film, which we might actually agree with some of the things that's said on it. We'll be right back.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Some of you are in states where the lockdown has begun to change, and we'd love to know your thoughts, because that's one of the things we want to talk about next. I think it is our third article we've posted here by Betsy McCoy, who's been on the program with us in the past, an individual that is the chairman of the Committee to Reduce Infection Deaths, former lieutenant governor of the state of New York, and an individual that has really spoken out on some of these issues. And her piece is Prolonging the Shutdown Defies Science and the U.S. Constitution. Let's take the science part first. And for our listeners out there in California, let me quote from your governor, and that is Gavin Newsom said the other day, we're not going to go back to normal. It's a new normal with adaptations and modifications until we get to immunity and a vaccine. Or for our listeners in the state of New York, how about Governor Andrew Cuomo says, you know, we just are not going to change anything until we can assure that no one else will die. Well, that's like forever, right? Yeah. And somewhere along the line, we need to inject some reality into this. And the reality, Dr. Merrill Matthews, is that in any disease, sadly, we wish it wouldn't happen, but it is the case, people are going to die.
People are going to die, and especially with the respiratory diseases like the flu, and the coronavirus is a respiratory disease. And, of course, they're now predicting that we'll probably see a resurgence come either end of summer, early part of the fall, about the time that you see the flu coming back, with some suggesting we may end up having to lock down again. I'm going to be extremely surprised if the public will go along with that. But that's the case. And, of course, the vaccine, they will hope they have a vaccine developed by the end of the year. President Trump thinks they might have that. Some have suggested they might be able to do something in September. But I will go back and point out that when you look at the vaccination rate for adults for the flu, about half of adults get the flu vaccine. The other half don't. A higher percentage of children will get it, but you've got an awful lot of people, even with the flu vaccine out there, who don't choose to get the vaccine. That's their choice. So I'm not sure that even a coronavirus vaccine is the solution, unless the government tries to force people to do it. They'll get a lot of pushback for that. That's probably not going to happen either. So that's why I go back to having something like remdesivir. If you have something which is a treatment, which doesn't cure it, but does reduce the symptoms, and the vast majority of people walk away from this maybe having had some rough days, but they can walk away from it, that's probably your best bet.
But again, and part of this has to do with, of course, the science. The other part of it is this lockdown right now. Some of the mayors and some of the governors seem to kind of like some of this power. Should I pick on the women first? How about the governor of Maine, the governor of Michigan? Let's pick on a few men. Of course, I just mentioned a few of them. Just seem to think that these more draconian, more extreme kinds of lockdowns, Penna, are ones that just need to take place. But if the normal never will exist, the new normal will mean that we will always have these kinds of restrictions. I just think the American people are going to simply say, well, you can have all the orders and regulations you want, but we're just going to go back to business as usual anyway.
Some people are going to do that. And, I think we're looking at this and we're saying, well, really, was all of this sacrifice worth it? And we don't have all the numbers in. Of course, we have a long way to go before we really know the quote-unquote science. But it's not a good trade-off to say you either choose science or you choose money. I mean, they go together. And one of the ways that happens is that look at all the doctors that have closed their offices or aren't doing everything that they would normally be doing, or even the hospitals during normal times. It's starting to build up. I mean, you're starting to see people not getting their checkups, not getting their surgeries, for instance. Some people are, waiting to get quote unquote elective surgery. Yeah, it may be elective. I chose to have it. I didn't have to have it as an emergency, but I need that surgery, and I've been waiting an extra month or two to get it. And, just people that don't want to go for something that's bothering them, maybe some kind of a pain they've got. They don't go and have it looked at, and, they end up with something that treatment should have begun on. So there's a lot of, that choice between science and money is not really a choice. And so I think, some people are saying that social distancing is too high a price. It's made us pay too high of a price. We'll see. But I think that it's proving itself to perhaps not have been the best solution.
Dr. Merrill Matthews, because you've looked at health statistics, there are a lot of people in emergency rooms that saying, I'm seeing nobody coming in with a heart attack, nobody coming in with a stroke, because they're probably dying at home, because usually we have people coming in for that. We have individuals that maybe later will be dying of cancer because we haven't been doing biopsies, we haven't been doing mammograms, we haven't been doing colonoscopies. It seems to me that there's a cost that we maybe don't see right now, but it's a big cost.
And one of the amazing things is one of the hardest hit industries in this is the hospital industry. Right. We've got over 6,000 hospitals. As you pointed out earlier in the show, an awful lot of counties don't have any cases or any deaths. So you've got these lockdowns that are going on for most states across the board. Now, Texas, we've got a number of counties that don't have many people in them at all. So if there were a hospital there, the notion that they could stay open and continue to do things would make perfect sense. But we've done a one size fits all, not really so much because governors have varied some, but it's been a generally similar approach across the country. And that has hurt hospitals. It's hurt patients. It has, it's created a lot of problems for patients who can't get in to get a re-prescription. But it has turned more and more people over to telemedicine, seeing their doctor through their computer or their cell phone or on their desktop. And that's probably a change we've needed, but people have been reluctant to embrace it. I suspect we'll see more of that now.
My commentary today is on burden of proof, and it's something that Andrew McCarthy talks about. We have a burden of proof that if I'm going to take your liberty away from you, or in a criminal case, take your life away from you, the burden of proof is upon the government. But we sort of reverse the burden of proof all of a sudden, where we should say, okay, government, you have to show us that these models, which we just pointed out in last segment, didn't actually predict the right things, that if you're going to really side on the public safety side, and we appreciate the fact that you want to do so, it's your burden of proof to show us that this is going to be helpful. And in light of some of the things we've looked at so far, when so many of these deaths have taken place in these nursing homes and to individuals who had some kind of mitigating health issue, we usually quarantine people that are sick or people that are vulnerable, not the entire population.
Right. And this time we've quarantined the healthy as well. So it's been a strange new approach there. And you and I have talked about this in the past. There are no studies that show that social distancing, there's no placebo-controlled type studies that show that social distancing work. It makes a certain amount of sense. It seems logical, but we don't actually know from science, I don't think, if that in fact is effective.
I did point that out the other day, and some other people have pointed that out as well. If you go to the CDC website, it talks about social distancing, but there's no footnote, the things you and I like to look at, that point to some of those kinds of studies. So I need to take a break, but I know we want to get into that because Penna's got some material on this, and we've only talked about part of this, whether or not science promotes shutdowns. What about the Constitution and censorship of social media? All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we go forward on removing restrictions from the lockdown, how should we make rational and intelligent decisions? Andrew McCarthy brings us back to our legal system that places the burden of proof on the government. He recognizes that trying to make reasonable decisions about the pandemic during an election year is difficult. Everything, including science, has been politicized. Of course, it was politicized even before the election season arrived, but now it is worse. That is why he says government should bear the burden of proof. He says day after day, the system pits the government's compelling interest in public safety against our most fundamental freedoms, liberty, property, and in capital cases, life itself. By contrast, the argument from authority has no place in our justice system. We don't deprive people of their fundamental freedoms merely because an expert or a professional says that it should be limited. Our judicial system requires that the government bear the burden of proof. Accused Americans are presumed innocent. They are entitled to their fundamental liberties and do not have to prove their entitlement. In the current case, the public safety side and the liberty side need to examine scientists and even summon their own scientific witnesses, and their assessment can be subjected to cross-examination. Consider another issue, whether a business is essential or non-essential. It is not an American's burden to prove that his or her job is essential rather than non-essential, as some government official subjectively defines those terms. It is the government's burden to prove that the job in question cannot be performed safely under any conditions. These are the rules we use in court. No one wants to see infectious disease spread. No one wants to see the economy destroyed. Let's apply these century-old principles as we move forward to try to return the country to normalcy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the articles we posted here is by Betsy McCoy, Prolonging the Shutdown Defies Science and the U.S. Constitution. And we're going to stay on the science issue for just a minute. But Penna Dexter, you have a piece that we posted 2 days ago, and it was about social distancing. And I think it reinforced what Dr. Merrill Matthews was talking about just a minute ago. It's like you would think we'd have some studies that would document how effective social distancing is in terms of preventing infection, but we don't seem to have those studies, do we?
We haven't really done it. We're doing it now. This was a good piece that I picked up from you posting it the other day when you were hosting, Kerby, and I thought it was really interesting. So I'm kind of bringing it back a little bit to talk about it. But, it asks the question, certainly every variable and every side effect of social distancing has been factored into this economy-crushing mitigation strategy, right? No, unfortunately and maddeningly. And one expert that we've read about and seen quoted is Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He was former head of the FDA, and he's been for social distancing. He's been recommending it. But he said on Sunday that the draconian measures aren't working as the experts promised. And he said this on Face the Nation. He said 20 to 30,000 new reported cases per day is, it's concerning and wasn't expected with these lockdown measures. And some states who've had some pretty drastic lockdowns, like Virginia and Maryland, they're not really seeing the lowering of numbers. In fact, the numbers are still very high. So the piece says the alarming reality is that social distancing never has been tested on a massive scale in the modern age. its current formula was conceived during the Bush administration, and it was met with skepticism. They couldn't believe it would work, but now we're using it, and it may not be as working as well as expected, or as they'd hoped.
And I was glad to hear someone on the radio this morning, a clinical psychologist, saying, I don't like the term social distancing. I think we ought to use physical distancing.
Yeah.
Because she was talking about some of the struggles that people have who are mental health challenges and just people who need to be around other people. And the whole social distancing thing conveys a different message to them. And I actually agree with that, because what we're talking about typically is physical distancing and keeping ourselves a certain amount of distance there. And as I mentioned earlier, it makes a certain amount of sense, but we don't know that in fact is that helpful. And it will be amazing if we come out on the other side of this, into this year, early next year, and they're looking back saying, we did all that social distancing thing, and it really wasn't that effective.
Yes. And again, it gets back to some of the costs. You mentioned one just a minute ago. I did a commentary earlier in the week in which I talked about when we look at this, Penna was talking about this a minute ago, it's jobs or the economy versus lives. But it really is much more than that, because it isn't just the impact that this is having on the economy. It's the impact that the lockdown is having right now on mental health. Mm-hmm. Almost anybody you talk to right now is talking about the very significant rise in various mental health issues. Earlier this week, we talked with Josh McDowell about the issue of loneliness, addiction, pornography. I mean, you just go down this long list, and all sorts of other things that are happening. So that is the case. And then even when you look at the economic issues, you recognize that a lot of people, for example, the governor said, well, we're not going to do this for the stock market. Well, to be perfectly blunt, the people that are invested in the stock market probably have savings. What about the people that are living literally paycheck to paycheck and have nothing in the refrigerator? Oh, and if you think it's bad here, earlier in the week, we quoted from Dennis Prager talking about the estimates on the number of people that will die of starvation around the world. Mm. So these are some major issues, right?
We have an awful lot of legal immigrants in the U.S. who send, or even sometimes citizens who have gained citizenship status, but they send a lot of their money home to Africa, South America, and other places in order to be able to try to keep the families afloat, because there's so little income, so little money there, so that those remittances are the lifeline for an awful lot of people around the world, where people who are working here legally just send some of the money home. And I've already heard reports about South America and especially Africa, where people are not getting that money because they've been laid off. They might have been an Uber driver, taxi driver, something of that nature. They're not able to do that work. They can't send the money home.
Yes. So some major issues. I thought just before I take a break, I'd mention a couple of other things. Glenn Harlan Reynolds the other day in USA Today says, we've learned a few lessons. Number one, density kills. The comparison between New York City, which is our largest city, and Los Angeles, which is our second largest city, are striking because, again, Los Angeles is much more diverse and spread out, and yet a lot of the environmentalists wanted us to actually have more people living close together. One related to that is mass transit kills. Mm-hmm. Mass transit kills.
They don't really have a good mass transit system in L.A.,
But in New York, look at that.
Yeah.
Now thinking about, I got an idea. Why don't we clean these cars every night?
And I think it was like the first time we've cleaned it in 150 years or something like that with the statement.
Here.
Two more that you will appreciate. Bureaucracy kills, and that is, Penna was talking about that. The Centers for Disease Control actually raised the bar for testing requirements because it was a health emergency. So as a result, we had fewer people doing tests than before. And then, of course, the one I want to get to now, censorship kills. Of course, we know that in terms of China because they actually blocked information. But Betsy McCoy talks about we've got a lot of censorship taking place right now in social media. Have you noticed that? And, one of the examples she uses is the two California doctors, Bakersfield and Kern County. Mm-hmm. Whether you agree with them or not, I think they had looked at 5,000 different examples. And because they weren't actually in line with the World Health Organization, not the most reputable organization right now, they got pulled off of the social media. So that's kind of becoming an issue too, right, Penna?
Yeah. Wow. We need to have all the information we can have, and we need to be able to analyze it in in ways that make it valuable and useful to us. We're flying blind on so many things. We're starting to amass information, but we're just right in the middle of it. So it makes it hard.
And one of the things the two doctors made a point of, and this comes under the unintended consequences from this, was that our immune systems are built to have interaction with people because it gets hit by pathogens all the time.
Yes.
And our immune system picks up a little bit of that. It begins to fight, to develop, to be able to resolve that. But by isolating by ourselves, they're suggesting that you're not able to
building the immunity.
Yeah, you actually become less immune to things because you're not having those pathogens hit you in very small doses. And so they suggested that we may see a rash of people getting various diseases once we start moving back because our immune systems have not been able to respond to those things that we normally get on a daily basis. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds perfectly reasonable, and it would be, again, another one of the unintended consequences that you have from this and people not thinking it through.
They've oftentimes said that young people, if they're out there and with all the dust and everything, they're less likely to get some of those allergies. And I saw a Facebook meme the other day, and it showed this one kid in a farm, and he was drinking out of the same water trough as the cattle. It says, this is why farm kids have such better immune systems. And whether that's true or not, but there have been some people even suggesting the reason a lot of kids have peanut allergies because they're protected from it and all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So if there's even a shred of truth to that, you can honestly see why they were raising the issue. But whether they're right or wrong, when you start saying, no, we're going to just pull them off of the websites, that makes it more difficult to have an honest, fair interchange of ideas. And sometimes radically bizarre looking ideas tend out to be true, right?
You know, one thing I have appreciated is I know some people criticize President Trump's briefings, but we've gotten a lot of information over these months and over these weeks and months just about what they're thinking. We at least understand a little bit why some of the things are being done. And right or wrong, some of the information turns out to be wrong. But at least they're trying to share. I think they're sometimes almost oversharing, but that's better than the alternative that you don't know what's going on. So I think knowing things and being able to evaluate them is helpful.
Sure. Let's take a break, and when we come back, in some respects, we'll maybe move off of this, although it is interested to see how this comes together, because remember how the environmental movement said, well, we can't have plastic bags, and now they're saying you do not want to bring those other kind of bags into the grocery store. You want to use plastic bags, and so we may get into that. So that's one of our articles. But even before that, Paul Dreesen talks about this new film, and Dr. Merrill Matthews and I have seen parts of it, Planet of the Humans, and it's really an attempt to kind of push forward the green idea. But as they do so, and again, the producer is Michael Moore, you're going to actually see something. You need to mark this in your calendar, that Dr. Merrill Matthews and Michael Moore are going to agree on a few things here, because it actually, as I was watching the film, reminds me a lot of some articles I remember reading by Dr. Merrill Matthews in The Hill and even at IPI. So we'll talk about some of that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Dr. Merrill Matthews. And I put this particular article on Penna because I knew that Dr. Matthews would be able to help us out. He has, of course, been our go-to expert all these years on healthcare, but he's also become quite the expert on energy issues. And this film that was produced by Michael Moore is really an attempt to argue that, if nothing else, we've got to reevaluate how we actually use various energy sources in America. But it goes through in some detail, pointing out that the green solutions aren't solutions at all. And it just reminds me of articles over the years I've read by Dr. Merrill Matthews on what it would take to, for example, provide enough power for a city, how many windmills, how many turbines, how many solar panels you'd have to have. And this is just a failed experiment, which was something implemented under the Obama administration.
You know, it's funny that Michael Moore would make this. Of course, it doesn't mean that he's become a conservative or anything like that.
Not hardly.
But it does mean that he's looked at some of these other alternative energy sources and said, well, they do sometimes more damage than fossil fuels, right?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Yeah. Going back to the ethanol movement that started back in the late 70s when gas lines were long and so forth, the notion from the environmentalists was ethanol is typically corn, can be other things, but typically corn-based fuel that you could put into gasoline, and you would be able to help save the environment, reduce greenhouse gases and so forth. And it turns out that it takes a lot of effort to grow corn. It takes tractors, it takes water, it takes seed, it takes transportation of the corn. You have to pick the corn, you have to transport it to the ethanol factory, which turns it into ethanol. Then you have to transport it. When they do all that, it's hard on the land, and they've turned an awful lot of forest into corn because you can make a lot more from that. So many of the environmentalists have already started pushing back against the notion that ethanol is that green. And now with Michael Moore stepping up, because there's been some of us who've said for some time, the windmills out there that they put out in the country, they're huge, they're costly, they don't last that long, they have to be replaced. It takes a lot of material to make those things. A lot of people feel like they either get that they make noise, or there's a subtle sound that, and then of course
animals get stuck in them.
Bird killing machines.
Yeah,
and so there's been some pushback on that. And Michael Moore apparently is the first one who's sort of really in that camp, who's saying this isn't really working as well as we would like it to.
Well, also the part that the wind has to be blowing, the sun has to be shining, or you've got to go back and use your fossil fuels anyway.
Right, and typically what happens is you use the fossil fuels if you get, let's say in the Northeast, where some of the states have said we're going to go to 100% renewable energy. Well, are you going to do that in the middle of winter when it's really cold and the snow's out there and the sun hasn't been shining and you might not even get much wind? Are you going to take that and move? What about your trucks and tractors that are trying to plow the snow? They don't have that long of a life to be able to do that. Are you going to be able to do it with that? So it's just unrealistic, and the day may come, and I'm fine if the day comes where we find a clean energy that replaces fossil fuels at an affordable price. We're not there right now.
So this part of the article says this film crew that Michael Moore sent out, they filmed one of the turbines that's being erected. Each one is comprised of nearly 5 million pounds of concrete, steel, aluminum, copper, plastic, cobalt, rare earths, fiberglass, and materials. Every step in the mining process, processing, manufacturing, transportation, blah, blah, blah. And then 20 years later, you have to start all over and remove it and build a new one.
Right. And I actually did looked into this a while back, and if I remember right, we have about 60,000 wind turbines out there right now. If you were to replace the fossil fuels that we're using to generate electricity, and this isn't talking about running ships or airplanes, or this is just generating electricity, you would have to have something like 600,000 more wind turbines out there, and they have to be and the wind turbines have to be socially distanced. They have to have a certain amount of space because of the wind and so forth. You can't just jam them all right there together. So
the one Penna was talking about is I watched that part there, and then they go off to Vermont, and I go to Vermont every year because it's such a beautiful place, and they take this mountaintop, and they just level this mountaintop, and you can see all these Vermonters going, oh my gosh, look what they've done. This used to be where our kids went. We used to drink from the water and the streams, and this is just a disaster. And then it's killing the birds, and it's making noise and all of the rest. And of course, as we point out, we're talking about killing sometimes rare and endangered species, taking acres of forest and deserts and grasslands. They show the former governor of the state of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, out there looking at this, and they're then showing what it looks like, in which some of the mirrors are broken, and it's out there in the desert, and it's just a total disaster. And so, if nothing else, the narrator, Jeff Gibbs, who's kind of a pro-environmentalist, is just simply saying, basically, as fellow environmentalists, this is a disaster. And if nothing else, he then quotes and shows things from Sierra Club and a variety of others, but it's basically the emperor has no clothes, and let's at least admit that we don't have very good answers for all this.
Yeah, and he doesn't even mention this, but a lot of times these kinds of energy sources have to be subsidized. People can't afford them. They're very expensive, so the government has to subsidize this. And, you know, as Buddy said, when there comes a time when there's a source of energy that's affordable for people and that is not fossil fuels, I think most people will be all for it. It's just that right now, the most efficient and cheapest source of energy tends to still come out of the ground.
There was a few years ago, and I think it was Tesla was experimenting with shingles that you would put on your roof, which were in small solar panels, and they looked like shingles. They showed, impacts, things like if hail was hitting it, and they look fine. If that were to come out and work and be affordable, that's a reasonable way to be able to put electricity in your house. There was another one I saw several years ago in which they said we ought to turn the streets into essentially solar panels. Right. And so what you'd be driving on was a solar panel, and that way, because we've got the cement here anyway, if you could put the solar panel underneath it, you're not doing anything different. Don't know if that's even feasible at all, but something like that might be a possibility if it worked. But we're just a long way from any of those things right now.
Let me just, before we go to a break, talk about the implications of this, and that is sometime we actually are going to have a Republican convention and a Democratic convention. And in the Democratic convention, there is no doubt that the Green New Deal will show up in these various platforms. And the reason for that is a very high percentage of those individuals are Bernie supporters, and so they really buy into this. And so in some respects, whether it is this particular film, which was produced by Michael Moore and narrated by Jeff Gibbs, or if they go to IPI.org, there's some good reasons to reject the Green New Deal, and not the least of which is it doesn't work. It's very expensive, and it actually probably in the long run will use more fuel than just burning the fuel, right?
Exactly right. And the amazing thing is they think that this has to be done in 10 years. You've got to transition all the way over. We have roughly 6 or 7% of our electricity is produced by wind energy right now. Maybe 1.5% or so, 2% of solar comes from solar. The rest of it's most of the rest of it's fossil fuels, and you just are not going to be able to replace that anytime soon. And if you were, you would be putting windmills everywhere.
Yeah. And so, again, I love this one part there because you were talking about this other one in Michigan. They're Lansing, Michigan. That's been in the news because it's the capital, but it's also Michigan State. And they show this particular solar farm, and it looks like a football field, Penna. And they ask, okay, well, how much would that provide power? And he says, well, 50 homes at peak solar intensity. But then it's not in this article, but on there he says, but realistically, it's only about 10 homes. And so you have something that's bigger than a football field that actually would only power 10 homes. And they said just to power the Michigan State University campus would require 15 square miles of these panels. And that's when you start doing the numbers. It just doesn't work.
None of this is very pretty either.
Oh,
I mean, these windmills, they don't look like the ones they have in Holland.
Not hardly. So anyway, those are just a couple issues that I thought we'd put on the table here. And that I thought would be just a little bit of a diversion from this whole idea. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about the pandemic. And if nothing else, sometime soon, we hope to have Heather McDonald back, because she's been talking about how you would hope that the research would be done by the most qualified, but apparently identity politics has entered into the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the Centers for Disease Control. So I thought we might chat about that for a second. And just before we wind down the program for today, let me just mention Penna Dexter's commentary right now is coming up, in case you haven't had a chance to hear it, Capitalism versus the Coronavirus, and all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
The left, predictably, exploits the coronavirus pandemic to bash capitalism. The Wall Street Journal's Kim Strassel counters, to the extent America is weathering this moment, it is in enormous part thanks to the strength, ingenuity, and flexibility of our thriving, competitive capitalist players. The U.S. response has not been without its problems, but capitalism is providing many more answers than a centralized economy ever could. Ms. Strassel points to a big mistake that surfaced early on. Government maintained control over early test development and blew it. The private sector came to the rescue. Many companies are now producing high-volume tests. Retailers like Walmart and CVS converted parking space to drive-through testing sites. Private labs are processing those tests. Scores of big pharma and small biotech firms are searching for treatments and vaccines. Last week, the Journal reported that a collection of America's top scientists, billionaires, and industry titans delivered unique and aggressive plans for dealing with the crisis to the White House. After the 2009 swine flu outbreak, the Obama administration failed to refill the national strategic stockpiles of personal protective equipment. Private industry geared up to meet the needs. Companies now making masks and gowns include the iconic Brooks Brothers and MyPillow, whose CEO Mike Lindell converted 75% of his production to masks. General Motors, Ford, and Tesla ramped up capabilities to make ventilators. Grocery stores are providing special hours for the elderly and vulnerable to shop. Some quickly ramped up online ordering, pickup, and delivery. Restaurants, to stay alive, are offering takeout, curbside pickup, and delivery. Comcast, Sprint, and Verizon are guaranteeing online service, so crucial right now, even for customers who can't pay. Amazon is allowing profits to decrease, even as deliveries have skyrocketed. Capitalism will allow some businesses to be decimated in this crisis, and it will allow others to rise and fuel a recovery. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that we, of course, have in studio with us today Penna Dexter, who, of course, if you have not had a chance to hear her commentary, we just aired it again. Of course, if you'd like to read it, we make it available. It's already on the website right now. And if you sign up, you'll get my commentary in your inbox Monday through Friday and hers on Saturday. So, again, that is one connection that we have. Just a minute, I'm going to send you to ipi.org, but I just had to bring this up because we'd like to get Heather McDonald on in the future. future. But Penna, you know who she is. And, of course, she has, of course, worked for many years with the Manhattan Institute. But this one just got my attention the other day when she was talking about should identity politics dictate vaccine research. I think all of us around the table would say, look, I want the best researchers doing research and finding a vaccine, and I don't care if they're black, white, yellow, or whatever. I mean, it doesn't matter. Yeah, that's not the issue. But nevertheless, apparently the CDC, which is the Centers for Disease Control, the NIH, National Institute of Health, and the National Science Foundation, NSF, have a diversity requirement, and you would think that that would be enough, but she says besides the usual preferences for women, blacks, and Hispanics, the following categories, and I'm not making this up, is the case: having been in foster care, having been eligible for free school lunches, having no parents with a bachelor's degree, having received food WIC payments or as a child or mother, claim to be black, or I saw some of them were being homeless, and a variety of others. This should not in any way relate to being able to do gene sequencing or cancer research. But that's what we find, how this identity politics has made its way into scientific research.
Yeah, I mean, we know that certain disciplines actually attract certain types of people. Sometimes, like, for instance, the sciences and engineering attract more men than women, for instance. So to force feed, a group of identity group into a certain discipline is going to reduce the quality of the output of that discipline. I mean, it just is. You can't. It drives me crazy because you want quality work.
Yes.
And that the purpose of this is not to have all different kinds of colors and genders in that discipline. The purpose is to get the quality work output so you can fix the problem.
You want science to be a meritocracy.
Right.
The people that can do the best job are the ones you want on the front lines, right?
And these are already changing. If I remember right, you have more women than men in medical schools
That is
right
true.
now.
That is true.
And if you've gone, at least the hospitals I've gone to lately, they are places of color. I mean, it's hard to find a white person around. I mean, they're Indian, Asian, African American, just a whole range of different things are moving into the STEM sciences, especially in engineering. You'll see that. So it's
amazing.
It's amazing how many people this is being solved by itself in people moving into these fields, and many of them are very, very gifted and qualified people. So why you would necessarily say we're going to try to get these? If you're going to try to find a homeless person with any real experience on gene sequencing, is just, I think it's going to be hard.
And again, we are so grateful that there are the Ben Carsons in the world that have succeeded so well in the medical field and the research field, and we would love to have more of those. But again, when you all of a sudden have what look like quotas, that's when it gets just so crazy, because if nothing else, we want to encourage diversity where we can encourage it. But just this whole article just makes you shake your head, and just the fact that I made Penna almost speechless is an illustration of how Heather McDonald just puts all this stuff on the table, and we'll spend some time.
You need an hour with her on this.
And this is just one of the things she's working on right now. She's just worked so hard in some of these areas. And when you live in New York City, as she does, you have lots of examples, don't you, of political correctness.
And the issue again is if you have a panel that's trying to look at how to do food stamps or something of that nature, women, infants, and children's program or something, then the notion that you might have a homeless person or something might make a certain amount of sense. But being homeless doesn't bring anything to gene sequencing. It's just not relevant.
It sure is not. Well, we'll leave it for another day, but I just wanted to real quickly talk about what you have at IPI.org. One of the articles here by, of course, an individual you worked with for decades, Tom Giovannetti, luring medical manufacturing home with the Beat China Act. We talked about the Tom Cotton piece of legislation in the Senate. This one is Chip Roy in the House.
Right.
But first of all, you have that. And then second of all, I also want to mention that you have an opportunity for all of our listeners to hear from Gordon Chang, who's been on the program with us.
Gordon Chang, who, as we mentioned earlier, was a critic of China before being a critic of China was cool. And he will be doing a Zoom conference with IPI in 2 weeks from yesterday, I believe.
Yeah, 21st.
And the 21st. And so that's available for people. They can go to IPI.org and they'll see the announcement there, and they can go and register if they're interested.
And again, I would encourage you to do it. And great decoupling from China. So again, just a great piece, and he's been in the studio with us and also by phone. But I thought we'd mention the other piece there as well, because we encouraged some of our listeners a while back to contact their 2 senators to support the Tom Cotton piece of legislation. This article here reminds us of the fact that there is a piece of legislation in the House which seems to have bipartisan support. But again, I appreciate the way Tom wrote this, and that is there are 2 ways to bring this about. One is by force, but we do believe in liberty. The other is by incentive, and this would be to provide some incentives so that we can bring some of these supply chains back to the United States and not be so dependent on China. Tell us more.
President Trump's lead trade one of his lead trade people, Peter Navarro, has suggested that we basically compel companies to bring, especially medical supply companies, pharmaceutical companies, to bring all manufacturing back to the U.S. What the Chip Roy's legislation does is says provide certain tax incentives that would encourage them to come back to the U.S. And so you're doing it with a carrot rather than a stick. And we don't know how many companies, if this were to pass, we don't know how many companies would do that. I would argue that an awful lot of companies are already coming back with their manufacturing because of the tax bill that passed in 2017. I think that the pandemic and the problems we're seeing with China is forcing a number of companies to say we need to pull out and do some other things and not be so dependent upon China. So some of those companies may be coming back. But it's a good way to try to attract companies here for good reasons.
And again, one of the things we have under our Take Action, if you click on the other Take Action, is protecting our pharmaceutical supply chain, and that was one opportunity for you to contact your senators. Since this one is in the House, maybe we'll also see if you could contact your member of Congress. This, I think, is something that's going to take place because we recognize that any time we're dependent on any country, including China, especially China, we should change some of that. So again, those informational pieces are at IPI.org. And if somebody wants to be participating in that Gordon Chang event, that's the 21st. There's a small registration fee, but it's a great opportunity for you to hear from a man that really brings so much to the table, right?
Right, yes. It'll be a very interesting conversation. He'll be talking about how what he calls the great decoupling from the U.S. from China, and he'll talk about that in the light of the pandemic and also the way things are changing and the future.
Well, very good. Penna Dexter, thank you for being here. Your commentary is here as well if people would like to hear that, and we've got all sorts of various articles for people to read today, right?
We do, and I hope everybody out there that's a mom has a happy Mother's Day.
Yeah, I was going to say happy Mother's Day to you, first of all, and happy Mother's Day, and those of you that do have moms that are still alive, I think this is one of those very important times to make sure that you pay respect to her as well. And it's going to be a little bit different with all this social distancing, or I guess we're going to call it now physical distancing. So that is the case. Next week, we got all sorts of other very important interviews. But if you find yourself saying you have covered a lot of topics, I'd like to read these for myself so that I can see whether or not I agree with what you've said. We have posted quite a number of articles today and also some links to IPI.org and all sorts of other ministries and organizations you need to know about. So simply go to pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here Monday right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.